I've been in New York City for 36 years, and for half of that, this blew my mind. I realized this about 2 weeks ago. 18 years, I've worked at Eurasia Group, which is it's a consulting firm that specializes in politics, global politics. We help our clients who are, in some cases, corporate clients, in some cases, financial market clients, energy clients as well, understand how politics in individual countries, individual regions of the world, and globally are impacting the opportunities and the risks that they're facing in the business environment, the investment environment, or in global markets. Unlike about 80 of my colleagues who have I think, unenviable job of covering one country or one region of the world or one economic sector all day, every day, I am, as Todd said, Director of Global Macro at Eurasia Group, which means I look at the world from 35,000 feet and I talk about the big trends that are going on in the world that create the framework in which a lot of our clients are trying to understand their place and the opportunities and risks that come with that. So what I want to do here over the next few minutes is to give you this framework for thinking about what is going on in the world right now in terms of politics and how that's going to impact you. Todd gave me a great lead-in talking about what's going on in Europe, the energy mix in Europe, what Russia has to do with that. As you'll see, I'm going to talk about that a lot. But let me also start by saying that over the 18 years that I've worked at Eurasia Group, when people ask me what I do for a living, and I tell them that I write about and make speeches about international politics, the response to that I get is almost always the same. They say, wow, you must be really busy right now. I've been getting that for 18 years. Because when I started, we were very busy trying to understand what was happening with Al-Qaeda and tracking the growth of the Islamic State and, the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and overall progress, if that's what you wanted to call it in those days, in the war on terror. And then we had a global financial crisis. And then we had a sovereign debt crisis in Europe that was so serious that the whole future of the Eurozone was in doubt for a little while. And then we had a wave of unrest sweeping across North Africa and the Middle East that came to be known as the Arab Spring. We had a guy who'd been in power in Egypt for 20 years thrown in jail in a matter of hours. We had a civil war in Syria. We had a civil war in Libya, unrest across the region. Then we had a migrant crisis where a lot of people, in response to what was going on in North Africa and the Middle East and Afghanistan, started to move toward Europe. And we had 2 million plus migrants suddenly arriving in Europe, which, not surprisingly, transformed the politics of Europe in short order. And then we had Brexit, when the UK decided that it no longer wanted to be part of the United States. And then Donald Trump became president of the United States, and that marked a huge disruption for good and for bad, I guess, for not just for American rivals or American enemies, but even American allies were trying to keep track as Donald Trump was redefining what America's role should be in the world. Then we had a global pandemic, and then Russia invaded Ukraine. So 18 years, we have been busy pretty much constantly. And of course, energy has played a huge role in all of that history. I remember in 2007, I think Brent was selling for $147 a barrel. I don't remember, maybe that was in July of 2007, I forget exactly. And then, as you know far better than I do, we had a revolution in energy production in America. And everybody figured out where the Bakken was and why it was important. And that energy revolution changed international politics very quickly. The price collapse in oil had repercussions, again, in the Middle East and around the world. And here we are again in a moment where there's a war going on in Ukraine. And as Todd was saying, there are huge, long-lasting, really important transitions going on in Europe and in the world. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit more in a minute. The question that I have not gotten used to, however, and this is what I want to anchor my comments on this morning is we have had questions from clients where they would ask us straight up a question I never thought I would hear. The question is globalization dead? And people are writing articles about this now. It's startling because we've lived with globalization as a fact of life really since the end of the Cold War. And let me be clear, let me define my terms here. When I say globalization, I'm talking about all of the processes by which it's not just goods and services, ideas, information, people, money, goods and services cross international borders at a velocity that is so much higher than anything in history that it's a qualitatively different process than we've ever seen before. This is the water that we swim in, globalization. Fish don't notice the water around them because they haven't lived with anything else. And now we're getting serious questions from clients. Is globalization dead? So let me start as I move into the body of my speech here by giving the answer to that question that we have at Eurasia Group. Is globalization dead? Yes. If you're Russia. If you're Russia, globalization is not coming back for the foreseeable future. If you're not Russia, globalization is alive and well. I'm going to start with the war. Obviously, you heard Todd speaking about the impact of the war in Europe in general, in Europe in particular, but I want to, in Germany in particular, but I want to spend some time on the war because this war is having so many different kinds of global impacts. Energy markets, food markets, European security, US-European relations, European politics, China. Because it's so important in international politics, I want to really spend some time. I want to take a step back and talk a little bit about where this war came from, because that will help us figure out a little bit more about where it's going and what its likely impact is going to be. So, for Vladimir Putin and for a lot of the people that he has empowered in Russia, particularly over the last few years, he's been in power for 22 years now, but there has been a change over the last 6 or 8, 10 years in who actually works in the Kremlin underneath Vladimir Putin. For these people, they go back to the end of the Cold War, and their idea is the Soviet Union did not really lose the Cold War. The Soviet Union was betrayed from inside. In 1990, when the Soviet Union was starting to break apart and Gorbachev's reforms created elections in the Soviet Union that allowed each of the 15 republics of the Soviet Union to elect their own republic president, and Russia elected Boris Yeltsin, who was determined to take the Soviet Union apart. There was a meeting in Minsk, in Belarus, between the presidents of the Russian, the Ukrainian, and the Belarusian republics, and they agreed at that meeting that they were going to secede from the Soviet Union. And from the moment they put their signatures on that document, that was really the end of the Soviet Union. It was inevitable by that point anyway, but that was the real dagger to the heart of the Soviet Union. Well, if you're Vladimir Putin, you're not really going to blame Boris Yeltsin for that openly, because Boris Yeltsin is the guy who made you prime minister and then president. And you don't need to blame Belarus, because Belarus now has a president who is so dependent on Russia that he's pretty obedient. Ukraine is a different matter. For hundreds of years, Ukraine has been at the heart of the Russian Empire. And there is no Russian Empire without Ukraine. There are small satellite states, but Ukraine is essential to the idea that a lot of Russians have about what Russia is. And so it's understandable why people focus on what's happened this year in Ukraine, or maybe some people go back to 2014 and they talk about what happened when the Russians invaded Crimea and the trouble that started in the Donbass region in eastern Ukraine. This is older than that. This is way older than that. As far as Putin and a lot of the people around him are concerned, Ukraine betrayed the Soviet Union, and that's how the Cold War ended. And Russia has been trying to bring Ukraine back into the fold pretty much ever since. Vladimir Putin came to power in the year 2000. And the original idea of how do you bring Ukraine under control was you have oligarchs in Ukraine, some of whom are ethnically Ukrainian, some are ethnically Russian, but they are powerful people in Ukraine who ultimately answer to the Kremlin. And the idea was we can manipulate Ukraine's politics by controlling these guys. And it didn't work. There was a presidential election in 2004, and the election was fixed. And Russia's guy, Viktor Yanukovych, won that election, and people protested in the streets and said, no, this election's being stolen from us. And that became what we at the time called the Orange Revolution. People have forgotten the Orange Revolution. This was going on right as I was starting at Eurasia Group. So they had to rerun the election because you couldn't get these people out of the streets. They reran the election. The other guy won, and Putin took a loss. And it's worth noting at the time that the Ukrainian president who won the rerun election ended up being poisoned. And his face was disfigured. I don't remember, you may not remember this story or know about this story, but Viktor Yushchenko, who at the time was president of Ukraine, his face was disfigured by poison. He has since recovered from that. He didn't die, and it was never proved who was responsible for that. But this is how long the Russians have been trying to plant their hand more firmly in Ukraine. So you move forward 10 years, Viktor Yanukovych finally gets into power, but he's limited in what he can do for Russia because everybody remembers the Orange Revolution. And he starts negotiating a trade agreement with the European Union. This is Russia's worst nightmare. This is Putin's worst nightmare. Ukraine is going to start to move toward Europe. And literally on the day when they're going to sign this commercial agreement with the EU, essentially the president of Ukraine was ordered by Vladimir Putin not to sign it, and he announced, we're not doing this. More people flowed into the streets, police flowed into the streets, protests started, it got ugly, shots were fired. Ultimately, 100 people were killed in 2014. But they couldn't get Ukrainian people out of the streets. And Viktor Yanukovych was forced to flee in the middle of the night, and he ended up in Moscow, where he still is today. Another humiliation for Vladimir Putin, and he immediately responded by invading Crimea, which I think is important to realize that while they may have had military plans in a desk drawer somewhere if we ever wanted to invade Crimea, this was completely improvised. I'm telling you all this background so you will understand how Putin understands what's happening in Ukraine right now and just how improvised and thrown together all of this is. This is important for where the war is going. So finally, we get to 2022, and Vladimir Putin has decided that time is not on their side. They have troops on the Russian border, they have troops on the Belarusian border, and people were asking us at Eurasia Group, people asked me personally, did I think Russia was about to invade Ukraine? And I said no, because it would be a bad idea to invade Ukraine. It wouldn't go well for Russia, and surely Putin knows that. But all the intelligence reports from the US and British governments said, no, they're going through all the motions it would take in order for them to do this. And then on February 24th, Putin gave the order and the invasion started. Now, the decision to full-on invade Ukraine was, to use a little political science jargon here, it was really stupid. It was the dumbest decision that any political leader of a major country has made since the end of World War II. By the way, at the end of, I'm keeping an eye on the clock because I want to leave time for questions. We're going to have microphones floating around. If anybody wants to challenge me on this historical point, maybe there's somebody that I'm forgetting, but this is an epically dumb decision that has gone wrong from the beginning. My mother knew the Ukrainians were going to fight back. I knew the Ukrainians were going to fight back because I've spent time in that part of the world. I studied in Russia for a while. My wife is from Kiev. I've been there recently. I knew the Ukrainians were going to fight back. Somehow Vladimir Putin didn't know that. The story is that when the first Russian troops crossed the border from Belarus, which is closer to the Ukrainian capital of Kiev, that's why they came from Belarus first, they had dress uniforms in their backpacks. What that means is that the expectation was that they were going to have a victory parade in Kiev within 72 to 96 hours. That was on February 24th. This is a spectacularly dumb decision. And this is why globalization is dead for Russia at this point. Because in ordering this invasion, knowing that you're not going to be able to back down, but not apparently knowing the Ukrainians are going to fight back, not knowing that your own military is not ready for this war, not knowing that the US and the Europeans were going to actually unite and do something forceful about this, they've left themselves in a position where they showed, Todd was talking about the calculation that Germany's made over the last 10 years about how it can make its energy transition while doing nothing to relieve its dependence on Russia. Vladimir Putin demonstrated for Europeans, particularly when it comes to energy, that he will never be a reliable commercial partner. You can never trust him again. They should have gotten this message a long time ago. They certainly should have got it in 2014. But now the Europeans are headed for a very rough winter, and they have made the decision to just completely to go through the ugly process of cutting all this off, cutting off their energy relationship with Russia and their trade relationship more broadly, such as it is, because they don't have a choice. Because Vladimir Putin has said, I'll turn the energy off, I'll turn the pipelines off, you won't get the energy, you'll freeze. And so the calculation in Europe is very simple. You can either allow Vladimir Putin to hold a gun to your head for one winter, maybe two, or you can leave him in a position where he can point that gun at your head anytime he wants to. This is the only reason why we're seeing all this. Look what has happened in Europe, not even beyond energy. What would it take to get Germany to double its defense spending? They're doing that. What would it take to get Finland and Sweden to join NATO? That's happening. What would it take for Europe to completely cut itself off from Russian oil? And again, to explain why this decision was such a dumb one for Putin, he said the purpose of the war was to do things. One, to denazify Ukraine. Interesting choice of words, given that Ukraine has a Jewish president. But denazify Ukraine and demilitarize Ukraine. By denazify, what he means is we're going to take down the current government. We're just going to take them out. And we're going to replace them with a government like the one in Belarus next door that will do what we tell them to do. And demilitarize Ukraine, make sure that we're going to take all the guns out of their hands so that they never have the opportunity to do this again. No more Orange Revolution, no more Revolution of Dignity in 2014, no more threat from Ukraine. We're going to take their guns away. So in terms of decapitating Ukraine, well, that obviously hasn't worked. A lot of people, including me, thought there was a very good chance that Volodymyr Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, would do what Charles de Gaulle did in World War II, hop a flight to London, form a government in exile, and lead the opposition from London. And Zelensky said, nope, this is my town, I'm not leaving, come and get me. So the taking down of the government part didn't work. In terms of the demilitarization part of it, Ukrainian soldiers now have the most powerful, the most sophisticated weapons they have ever had because Russia invaded and NATO is involved now.
We live in a globalized world. In some of the speeches I've made recently, I might do this in Des Moines, I talk about being a student and deciding that I had to go to the Berlin Wall because the Berlin Wall was suddenly open and people were, hitting it with hammers. And I wanted to do that. So I didn't have any money, but I put it on a credit card and I went there and I hit the Berlin Wall with a hammer and I came home with pieces of it. And I tell that story now just to illustrate how completely different the world that we live in is. That there is no way that you can throw up a wall overnight made out of cheap concrete and think that what's on the other side of that wall isn't going to impact our lives, and we can just go on about our business and not worry about what happens in the Middle East, in China, in Russia's neighborhood, in any part of the rest of the world. We do live in a globalized economy, and although globalization doesn't quite mean the same thing that it did 10, 15, 20 years ago, it's still a fact, and we can't go back. We're not going back. And so there are a lot of people that are looking to do business or invest in other countries, in other markets. There are also people who are investing right here in this country, people that are in the agriculture sector, people looking to buy farmland who know that there's a lot of risk that is being created for them halfway around the world that they need to understand. And so the company that I work for, Eurasia Group, does that. We help people understand the way the politics of individual countries or the big global political trends, like the kind that I talk about, are having a direct impact on their businesses and therefore on their lives. And, risk also creates opportunity. And it's not just like all the scary, terrible things that are happening. The world is changing in ways that, for people who understand, not just where the ball is now, but where the ball is going to be, there are opportunities in that can help people in their businesses and in their lives. Well, let me first say that, we shouldn't talk about the trade war in the past tense, because President Biden has not changed very much. And if we're talking about tariffs, President Biden hasn't really changed very much of what the Trump administration put in place. I will say that U.S.-China trade hit an all-time record in 2022, despite the tariffs. That's a very positive sign that underneath, what all of the strife in the U.S.-China relationship, there is still a recognition that on both sides that, hey, we got to do business. Our economy is not going to go up without your economy. That doesn't mean there isn't a lot of risk, but the fact that people have absorbed the risk that has come from the tariffs, particularly I know in the agriculture sector, the tariffs had a bigger impact than they did on a lot of other sectors. I think that the big emerging risk, maybe not emerging, already emerged risk in U.S.-China is more about the tech sector than anything else, just for a variety of reasons that have to do with the future of the global economy. But I think the first thing you do to prepare for risk is understand exactly what the risk is. The more refined your understanding of what is causing the problem and what are the factors that allow the problem to persist, the better you are at figuring out how you're going to hedge against that risk, how you're going to make a plan that allows for you to absorb some of the shocks that inevitably happen so that they don't knock you over.
As you look at the world right now, is it Gaza? Is it Russia's attack on Ukraine? Is it China? What's our biggest wild card, our biggest concern heading into 2024? Or are they all concerning in their own ways?
I think they're concerning in their own ways. I think the answer to your question, I think, is China. But I want to step back for a moment and say, where we are in Gaza is that the war is about to become a lot uglier and a lot more intense before it gets resolved, because the war in Gaza has now moved into the parts of the country where a lot of the civilians, they don't have anywhere to evacuate to at this point. They can't stay out of the way much longer. So it's already really, really bloody. Israel and by extension, the United States are suffering a lot of international reputational damage from that, particularly from people who are in parts of the world where media isn't necessarily providing them with the opportunity to figure out how this whole conflict started. There are a lot of people that don't know that Hamas murdered 1,200 people to kick this off. But the truth is, in that case, there is some reason for long-term, and I would underline a long-term optimism on the other side of all of this horror that is going on right now, because the current leadership in Israel, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, and the leadership of Hamas are both going to be sidelined when this is over. Netanyahu is unbelievably unpopular and only remains the prime minister because there's an active war going on. As soon as this phase of the war is over, Netanyahu is going to be out, and there may not be a lot of Hamas's command and control left. That creates a long-term opportunity. If you have new leadership that has a different understanding of what it is going to take to actually have a sustainable peace in that region of the world, and if you have outside players, I'm thinking mainly of Saudi Arabia, but some others as well, that have been looking for business opportunities there and looking for an opportunity to make peace with Israel, there are things they can do for the Palestinians as well. The hopeful view is that what comes out of all of this horrible situation is at least the chance, certainly not a guarantee, that things there can get better. Russia and Ukraine have settled into a stalemate, kind of war of attrition. I think that my shorthand way of talking about the war is to say that it's not clear that Ukraine can win the war. It is clear that Russia lost the war in the first 72 hours because Russia has isolated itself permanently, or at least as long as Vladimir Putin is alive. Europe is not going to go back to buying Russia's main exports anymore. Russia still has customers in Asia, but they're getting discount prices for the oil and gas and other commodities that Russia is still exporting. So Russia's basically become a rogue state.
And that's not sustainable, right? The discounted that they're offering?
Well, it is, we'll see how long it's sustainable. It's certainly, it's sustainable for Russia in the medium term just because they have such an abundance of commodities. And it's certainly in China's interest to keep Russia on its feet. But the Chinese are not helping the Russians in Ukraine. The Chinese are just trying to keep Russia from collapsing, essentially, and also, buying some energy at bargain basement prices, which is really good if you're China and you're the biggest, importer of oil in the world. So Russia is sort of become a permanent rogue state, a kind of bigger version of Iran or even North Korea, and that's a problem going forward. Ukraine is probably going to have to negotiate away some of its land at a certain point. Russia is still in charge of about 20% of Ukraine's territory. That may fluctuate a little bit. We'll see if there's going to be any big moves in 2024. You never know we don't see the weapons that can change the game very much. Eventually, if Ukraine has to give away 20% of its land in order to get a deal, there is probably a European future for Ukraine. But again, as with Middle East peace, that's not a 3-year project. That's a 10, 15-year project. So finally, I said that China is the big story because China has been the engine of the global economy, or at least the engine of global growth, I should say, for more than a generation now. And we know that China is not going to go back to the days when it was growing 10 or 12%. But hopefully demand in China is going to recover, particularly for people that are in agriculture. Hopefully China is going to begin to grow at a faster pace than it has grown coming out of COVID. Hopefully the U.S.-Chinese relationship will at least stabilize, which looks like where we are now, rather than continuing its spiral downhill. But the good news on China is, it's much more structurally important for every aspect of the global economy than either of the other two wars. The good news is that what we've seen from China is a recognition that if you're weak, that means you better be nice. It's not like North Korea where your weakness is sign that you need to become more belligerent and issue more threats. The fact that President Biden and President Xi of China had a very productive meeting in San Francisco last month at the APEC summit, that's a really good sign. At least they're talking. That China is reaching out to Japan and South Korea, that's good. That China is trying to improve its relationship with Europe. We're seeing something really good, which is China's response to crisis is to try and tone down the crisis and to bring us back closer to the status quo. China is recognizing that they benefit from the current system. They're not trying to destroy the current system. They're trying to bend it in their direction a little bit, but that's not what Russia's doing. That's not what Iran and North Korea are doing. And that's actually a very good news story, but there's a lot of risk. There's an election coming up in Taiwan next month that is really could, create some more friction in the U.S.-China relationship, because we think there's a good chance that the guy that China does not want to win the Taiwan election is going to win. So, and we're also, we're always one spy balloon away from things going sour in the relationship. So that's the big story. That's the one we got to keep an eye on. For the moment, it's going in a constructive direction. When are these tariffs coming down? Well, I think we're going to have a generational change in leadership before that happens. But again, I just emphasized that the U.S.-China relationship continues to grow pretty strongly despite the tariffs, because there is demand on both sides for a better economy that helps both countries